You guys ever see a story where the main characters have to save the world? Rhetorical question, I know you have. They're fucking everywhere, and so many of them seem to be missing the point of blowing things out of proportion like that. Storytellers and audiences often have this conflict of interest where the writer thinks the stakes need to be higher than imaginable to hold the audience's attention, when in reality there's nothing more boring than grand, overblown scenarios that lack a human touch. It's an understandable tendency as a creator to think that logically the higher the stakes would be if the situation was real, the higher they'll be in the story. But the problem is that the situation isn't real. When the audience sits down to experience her story, they know that they're experiencing a story, and this disconnect creates a number of problems. Unless they're a little kid, they know that when you blow up a planet, billions of people didn't actually just die, it was just a prop, a stunt, an animation, whatever. So how do we transcend that it's just a story mentality? How do you get the audience to care about what happens on screen? Step 1. Craft sympathetic characters. The basis for all audience investment are the characters. I've said it before, but characters are the audience's window into the story. We see through the characters' eyes, so to speak, as the story unfolds. Thus, how much we care about the characters is a critical part of being invested in the story at all. So the question becomes, how do you get the audience invested in a character? It has nothing to do with likability. There are plenty of characters who you root for despite actually being real pieces of shit. Being invested in a character instead comes from empathy. If you can empathize with a character, you find yourself caring because you subconsciously put yourself into their shoes. So not only do you have to make them relatable, so to speak, you also have to write them so that they feel like real people, giving them well-rounded but defined personalities, plenty of flaws and fallibility, and motivations or desires with good reasoning behind them. If you do that, the story should at least have enough stakes to hold your attention. Because, while the audience may not really care about all these random people on Yavin 4 about to get blown up, they do care about Luke, flying into the belly of the beast in an attempt to save them. You can still take the whole we have to save the world approach and heighten the stakes beyond belief, but if you want your audience to care, then your characters need to be among the chaos, dealing with their own failures and hang-ups as they strive to save everything. We're only going to care about the entire world being taken over by the bad guy if we can see the effect these events have on the people whose motivations we're invested in. Step 2. Establish stakes for something that could actually happen. Now, while characters are key to at least a base level of interest in what's at stake, there are moments and places in which a story will call for an extreme level of suspense, where the incredibly high stakes are the source of the fun. Usually you don't find this in more lighthearted, comedic, or kid-friendly stories, but there are exceptions to that as well. So, in order to create that suspense, what do you put at stake? Putting the characters' lives in danger is a very tried and true way to establish at least a small amount of tension, but once again, that disconnect between story and audience comes back to bite us in the ass. Unless you're writing a horror story or following a dark, hopeless tone, threatening to kill characters as your only source of tension is going to come across as a little toothless, since the audience is probably going to know that your main characters aren't going to die in the middle of the story. This is a concept called plot armor, and it doesn't just apply to character death. Sometimes it's just obvious that a story isn't going to go in a particular direction. I doubt anyone really thought Season 3 of Daredevil was going to be about Elektra and Matt traveling the world by themselves and fighting ninjas in the streets of Paris. I'm not saying that wouldn't have been fucking awesome, but I am saying that we all knew it wasn't going to happen. The method for finding the chinks in that pesky plot armor is to put something at stake that could actually happen without ruining the story or changing its course entirely. Of course, this is largely subjective and is going to be different for every story, but while the audience may be certain the main character isn't going to die, they may not be as sure about whether or not the main character is going to get what they want or need to be happy. And if you've done your job and gotten the audience invested in the character, then they'll genuinely care about whether or not this occurs. By putting this personal touch on suspense, it creates an uncertainty that you just don't get when someone's life is in danger. In a story, I mean. Step 3. Immerse them in your world. A lot of times people assume that immersion is a term that only applies to video games. Immersion is really just deep mental involvement, but in this case it refers more to mental involvement so deep that you forget the rest of the world exists. You stop thinking of the movie you're watching or book you're reading or whatever as a story, and more as its own little universe that you're peering into. A universe where, like our own, anything can happen. In other words, the more you forget you're experiencing a story, the higher the stakes will rise, because that disconnect between story and audience that creates things like plot armor starts to fade into the subconscious. I've talked about immersion in my FPS video, but I'll say it again here. Immersion is sold by taking a consistent angle. If anything is out of whack or off about your story choices, whether it's someone being being out of character, or sudden tonal variations, or random genre shifts, then distance is going to grow between the audience, characters, and story, thus making the disconnect between them even more powerful. So, while it might not be a tool for increasing stakes, writing consistently is an important aspect of maintaining them. Step 4. Build stakes and then keep them alive. This lesson usually applies to creating stakes by way of a particularly threatening villain, monster, or antagonistic force, but it can apply to different situations as well. If you want something to be threatening and create suspense, then you need to establish it as a danger to your character's happiness or objectives or life or whatever. Let's go back to the Death Star example. Imagine how lame it would be if we never got to see the Death Star actually destroy a planet. Not just because we'd never get to see its destructive power, but because when the stakes later hit the ceiling with the Death Star threatening the Rebel base, we wouldn't have anything to look back on and go, oh shit, that's gonna happen to the Rebels. This kinda ties into that whole show don't tell advice that teachers love to cram down your throat. If you want something to be threatening and create suspense, you need to show why the audience/characters should fear it. You can't just tell the audience that something is spoopy. Humans are distrustful by nature, they gotta see shit with their own eyes to believe it. This advice doesn't just apply to creating tension with villains or other living creatures, but also antagonistic forces, and even sometimes the tone of your story. Sometimes you need to establish that the tone is dark enough for something bad to happen in order to effectively threaten that it will. Then there's the second part of building stakes, and that's keeping them alive by not undercutting them. Now, I hate to use this example since the dead body of this show has already been stomped on by so many people at this point, it's really just a bunch of red goo, but Sword Art Online happens to have the perfect example of what I'm talking about. There's a moment around halfway through the show in which a sweet, adorable little character named Yui is introduced, and from the moment she begins to exist, it's obvious she's going to die. You see, the show has worked very hard up until this point to create an environment in which anyone can die at any moment. In fact, it's the only thing it really accomplishes at all. The antagonist, being the game they're playing, has been established well as something to fear, but at the time of Yui's introduction, the danger the game presents hadn't reared its head in some time. So, by introducing Yui specifically to die rather than demonstrating it has the balls to kill a pre-established character, the show undercuts its own stakes by showing it isn't willing to pull that trigger. And they don't follow through completely with killing Yui either. For the rest of the show, no one dies and the stakes are non-existent. If you want to hear more about how terrible of a story decision this is, watch the Mother's Basement video on it, link down below. But hopefully you see my point already. You can't just establish stakes and leave it at that. You have to maintain them by demonstrating that you're willing to make good on your threats. Think of it like killing a hostage's friends during interrogation. But something that needs to be kept in mind with the implementation of these 4 steps is that not all stories call for extremely high stakes. At the same time, a story without any stakes is just going to be fucking boring, so you have to find that balance. Look at the tone of your story and the themes you're presenting and figure out how high you want the stakes to be. The last thing you want is a story that really needs to be nail-biting in order to work and doesn't accomplish that. But no matter the genre or tone, that first step about the characters applies. When your characters feel well-rounded and human, when their struggles are tied to their wants and desires, when their plot lines have a personal touch, only then will it be compelling to watch as they save the world.